Mainstream media keeps feeding us narratives about Russia without ever bothering going there. In contrast, a man who has been listening in on the Russian viewpoint for a long time is Larry C. Johnson, a former CIA analyst and member of the group Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity. He's joining me again today. Larry, welcome back.
Hey, Pasquale, thank you again for the invitation. This time I don't have to show up as Larry Wilkerson. I was able to grow my hair out.
The background story here is that I reached out to you thinking I'm reaching out to Larry Wilkerson because the emails got kind of entangled, but I'm very glad that you then came on the show and that we now get to talk as well. And I want to dedicate an episode to your work.
Sure.
Because you've been working with Russia and about, Russia for a long time. You've been trying to understand them. So I wanted to ask you, what your time at the CIA and as an analyst, how did you get into the topic on Russia and how did you approach it from the early days?
I actually largely my only exposure to Russia back in when I was started at CIA was I did an 8-week internship on the Afghan task force. So that's when the Soviets were in Afghanistan, and I worked in the covert action arm. So we produced propaganda to try to rally world opinion against the Soviets. My contribution was I had T-shirts made up with the pictures of Afghan refugees. And we were passing these out. CIA was passing them out on the beaches of Uruguay at Punta del Este. And the T-shirt said, "These children can't go home for Christmas." Now, ignore the fact that they're Muslims and don't celebrate Christmas, okay?
All right.
So call that my first real exposure. When I became an analyst, I do recall there was one time we got a collection of documents where the Sandinistas were desperate to get some advice from the Russians on how to deal with the threat of shoulder-fired surface-to-air missiles against helicopters. So my job, I was having to translate those documents. But, I had never really delved into Russian culture, Russian history that much until the start of the special military operation. And it seemed off. I was just saying, we're trying to provoke a fight. We're not trying to avoid it. We're trying to provoke it. And hence the title of Scott Horton's book. So then I started just digging in and recognizing that, we just had a blind spot in the United States when it came to Russia, not even knowing the history. When I read Alex Craner's book, several years ago, where he on Bill Browder, the grandson of the founder of the Communist Party in the United States, or one of the heads of the Communist Party, and then Browder's subsequent anger at Putin, basically because Putin is not a communist. I just I started writing, trying to be objective and step back and say, look, this constant expansion of NATO to the east was without justification. And when you go back in history and you say, okay, give me the list of all the countries that Russia has invaded since 1991. Well, none. And people say, well, what about Georgia? Well, in the case of Georgia, the Russian had deployed peacekeepers there since the collapse of the Soviet Union, because there were still territorial disputes within Georgia between these other territories. And it was the Georgians that attacked the Russians. So, and with the strong encouragement of NATO, by the way. So, just as I stepped back and looked and realized Russia has been the victim in this. I got into it a lot in 2016 with the whole Russiagate nonsense, because I had some access to information at the time. I'm the one who went to Devin Nunes on March 12th of 2017 to warn him about Russiagate, that this was an intelligence operation that involved MI6, GCHQ, FBI, and CIA. I provided him a couple of names of people he needed to talk to and the kind of documents he needed to see. And that's what led then Devin Nunes to launching that whole investigation. Kash Patel was his investigator. But so my knowledge at the time that Russia was being completely set up as a fall guy. They were just a convenient enemy. And so when you start, I get angry when I see people lying about issues like that because people end up getting killed.
Yeah, but the thing is, they lie on like so many levels. And just as a side note, like there is an official report commissioned by the European Union and executed by a Swiss diplomat, Heidi Tagliavini, and the Tagliavini report explicitly states, the first shots were fired by the Georgians. There's no question about that. Who started the war? And still to this day, the German chancellor and so on keeps repeating Russia, which started the war against Georgia. It's just like the untruths, the lies that are being told are just, it happened on several levels. With the Russiagate issue, I've been wondering, I mean, some people, Glenn Greenwald and so on, they interpret it mainly as a way for the DNC for the Democrats to kind of excuse away this absolutely unforeseen loss of the presidency, right? They really thought they got it locked in, right? Until the end, they thought like Trump. They build up Trump in order to have somebody who's easy to take down, and so he interprets this as a haywire, as a way that the Democrats then started a rumor that just completely went haywire. Do you also see it like that, or do you see like other motivations behind like Russiagate?
Oh no, it was far deeper than that. So one of my former CIA colleagues, let me just put, he served in several hot spots in Lebanon, Salvador. He was in Lebanon when the chief of station, William Buckley, was kidnapped and then killed. So experienced fellow with operations and CIA, some of the most sensitive areas. I had started writing in 2016 after the Christopher Steele document came out, because my small consulting firm, I had two other partners at the time. We knew we'd write reports, but not like that. I mean, this thing was an embarrassment, and it had so many obvious errors. And so I started writing about it, and in the course of this, my CIA buddy called me up and said, "Hey, you're not going to believe this." He said he just had a conversation with one of his former colleagues who was still at the agency, and his former colleague said, "Hey, in the summer of 2015, John Brennan, then head of the CIA, organized a task force." A task force brings together people from other agencies. So you'll have people maybe from DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency, and from the National Security Agency, and from the DOD on operational side, and maybe state INR, FBI. Peter Strzok, for example, was, I think, at one point part of that task force. The task force in the summer of 2015 was tasked to collect intelligence on all of the presidential candidates except Hillary.
Tasked by who?
Well, John Brennan assigned the task, and he was doing it at the behest of Hillary and her campaign. And so remember, at the time, it wasn't certain that, in fact, most people were making jokes that Donald Trump would never win the presidency. So they were collecting intelligence on Trump, on Marco Rubio, on Ted Cruz, and on Bernie Sanders. It wasn't just on Republicans. It was also on Sanders. And the way they got around this, they'd use foreign intelligence operators. So the NSA is prohibited from collecting intelligence on me. But they can call GCHQ in Britain. My God, they can collect on me, and then they can just pass it to NSA because it's what's called liaison intelligence. So that's what was going on. It wasn't just GCHQ. The Belgians were involved. The Germans were involved. The Aussies were involved. And this was a pretty comprehensive, coordinated effort. So, for example, how did they get onto George Papadopoulos? I mean, George Papadopoulos, nice guy, nice kid. I've met him and his wife and talked to him, and I've interviewed him, but he was a nobody. And yet, in August of 2015, he's in London, and he either called, texted, or emailed Corey Lewandowski about, hey, I'd like to get involved with the Trump team. Well, guess what? That communication was intercepted by GCHQ. And it was then filtered into the John Brennan Task Force. And then an intelligence operation was constructed to entrap Papadopoulos. I mean, it sounds crazy, but this is exactly what happened. Papadopoulos then out of the blue gets offered a job as a vice president for this consulting firm in London, which turns out later it was an MI6 front. And so, and then we have an email exchange between Brent Budowski, who was a longtime Democrat operative in Washington, D.C., and John Podesta. And it was dated December. This came out in the WikiLeaks, one of their dumps of information. And there was Budowski and Podesta talking about how they were going to hang the Russian affair on Trump, make it all about Trump and his boyfriend Vladimir Putin. So as the campaign went on, and it became clear that Trump was most likely to win, that's when it all shifted to Trump, and the full force of the covert operation that Gina Haspel, the former director of CIA, was coordinating with British intelligence officers, went full blast starting in May 2016. So this was, and because the May 2016 date also coincides with when the CrowdStrike, when supposedly the Russians hacked the DNC. Complete nonsense. They didn't hack the DNC. Go back and read Dmitry Alperovich, the head of, who was the owner of CrowdStrike at the time. He gave two different accounts within 2 weeks of what happened. He said either it was the end of, one account he said end of April, other account he said first week of May. Okay, you can overlook that. But the message was that CrowdStrike knew from no later than May 5th of 2016 that the Russians had penetrated the DNC. They were on the inside, by God. So, you're a cybersecurity guy. What do? They sit back and do nothing until June 10th of 2016, at which point, 2 weeks, or actually more than 2 weeks after the emails had been taken from the DNC, because the DNC emails were taken, last day was May 25th. So we got 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 31. That's 6, and then 10 more days, June 10th, when CrowdStrike goes, stop the presses, shut down the servers. Oh my God, the Russians are here. Now, what happened was, because of the both CIA, NSA, MI6, GCH, everybody and his brother were spying on Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. Everything that went in, that was sent to them, they do.
They were a real threat, right?
Oh yeah. What do you mean by that?
WikiLeaks was a real threat to the intelligence community, right?
Well, from the standpoint that it published truthful information.
Yeah, but exactly. Like, as in precisely. I don't mean it's a friend to us, the commoners, and it's an enemy to those who work behind the shadows, right? Yeah.
Correct. And so what happened was, sometime, I don't know if it was on Monday the 27th, Tuesday the 28th. Anyway, they intercepted a communication between Seth Rich and Julian Assange, or with WikiLeaks. And it was Seth Rich which sent the information to WikiLeaks. Now, how do I know that? Another friend of mine who was when he dies, I'll be able to reveal his full position, but he's still alive. Uh, he told me, because I was working with a lawyer by the name of Ty Clevenger, and he was trying to get documents out of FBI, now the NSA. NSA sent him a document confirming that they did have 10 documents classified top secret related to Seth Rich. But my buddy said, they're lying. There's a lot more, a lot more. But the point was, they intercepted these documents from Seth Rich and knew. And so that's when they constructed this whole narrative of that it was the Russians that hacked it, and they were going to pin that on Trump. So that's really where it got launched, that part of the Russiagate with the DNC. Go ahead. I can see you getting ready to ask a question.
Yeah, because okay, so this goes all back to if it all goes back to the intelligence agencies. I just need to ask you. So we know that the Pentagon has never passed an audit in its existence. We know that the CIA is able to refuse, and the FBI is able to refuse requests for information from Congress. They just say like, I cannot tell you that because national security. So the security state in the US is like and the Pentagon is separate, right? It's not even part of it. But the security state is you cannot oversee it, right? So it's a state within a state, and it has all of these different branches, and it connects with those outside, like especially the Brits.
Correct.
How does that work? How does it run? I mean, is it a fiefdom? Who controls this thing?
Well, nobody really controls it. It does have sort of a bureaucratic inertia of its own. Now, that said, that doesn't mean to imply that they're terribly competent. There is a lot of incompetence and buffoonery that goes on. But it is dangerous from the standpoint that there is no independent oversight, despite the claims of the House Intelligence and the Senate Intelligence. In fact, here's how I know that. When Devin Nunes was first appointed to the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, my next-door neighbor, who happened to be the largest defense lobbyist in Washington, D.C., came to me and said, hey, I got this member of Congress. He's just been appointed to the Intelligence Committee, and he doesn't know anything about the CIA. Would you meet with him and sort of give him a heads up? I said, sure. And so I took with me my other friend that I referenced earlier, who had told me about his friend who told about the task force that John Brennan had set up inside CIA. We met Devin for lunch. I can't remember if it was lunch or dinner, late dinner or early dinner at the Republican Club up on Capitol Hill. And we spent about 2.5 hours briefing him up, giving him a foundation. So that's why that was in 2012. So that's like 5 years later when I had this information about what was really going on with Russiagate, I could call him up and get in to see him. So, and I think Devin is a very, honorable guy and really tried to, be fair. But my point is, he didn't have the knowledge base to know that when he was getting jerked around, and to, it was, he just had a little bit of knowledge. And when you're going up against the intelligence professionals, they know all they can do is, yeah. So, this was a joint intelligence operation between the CIA and the FBI at a minimum. And, really shame on Donald Trump that they're not going and taking further steps to expose this. But, it is what it is.
Can he? I mean, in theory, Tulsi Gabbard is now in charge of all of this. Do these people who sit on top are they able to even, drill down?
They can if they want. They can if they want. But that's, problem is you get this, let's not make waves. Let's not, this is going to create some other problems. This may compromise certain assets. But it needs to be exposed. I think Brennan, Comey, Clapper, they all need to be in prison. They actively work to subvert a democratic election. And this is, I'm not sitting here endorsing saying, I think Donald Trump is great or I endorse Donald Trump. I don't. but there's a way our system's supposed to work. They subverted it actively, and they tried to subvert it prior to the election. That failed. Then they were kicked into a backup plan after the election that involved, the impeachment efforts, setting up Mike Flynn, and then, again, perpetuating this myth. This is what's to me, so hilarious. We're really upset that some foreign government was interfering with our elections. Oh, what in the hell has the United States been doing since CIA started off working in 1947? The number of foreign countries that we have stolen elections, cooked elections, interfered both with covert action means as well as through public voice, like Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, the USIA, please. The hypocrisy in this is staggering. And yeah, Russia, they had $70,000 in Facebook ads. Oh, great.
I know, but doesn't it show this? Isn't it revealing, how allergic this apparatus is to the very things they do, because they're aware, right? And it's this projection, because we do it, we know the others must be trying too. But I do think the US is they have the best. It's just the best of the best when it comes to this game. I cannot imagine even the Russians coming even close to the success in interference ever, like even during the Cold War.
The Russians actually, to what I've seen, don't have a history of going out and doing all of the subtle, or let's call it the tsunami of propaganda to manipulate and control elections. I mean, if they want to go and interfere, they do it. They do like they did in Kazakhstan 2 years ago.
Yep.
Send in the troops, crack down on the crowd. Protect the existing government. But there are not a lot of. The latest one is that it's Venezuela. Venezuela has the one been stealing all these elections. Have you heard that one?
I haven't even heard of it yet, but
okay.
The level of nonsense about Venezuela has reached new heights, including like Venezuela is fueling Hamas and stuff like that. Or Hamas is in Venezuela. I mean, it gets so dumb that
there are there are members of Hezbollah or groups that are affiliated merchants. Let's be clear about what we're talking about. We're talking about Lebanese Muslim merchants, and they are family networks. The big center was in Cologne, Panama, at the Cologne Free Trade Zone. Until a few years back, Cologne Free Trade Zone was the second largest free trade zone in the world after Hong Kong. Massive place. And you have a number of from a diaspora that came out of the Middle East, the Levant, around the 1900s, that ended up, a lot of them settled in Panama. There's another center off the coast of Venezuela, Isla Margarita, that's sort of a smuggling hub. There is a town in northeast Colombia called Maicao. Maicao is it's primarily, it's not like Hamas is open and parading around, but you do have people who are sympathetic to the Palestinian cause and are Muslims. Also from Maicao in Colombia, you go to Ciudad del Este in Paraguay, on the border of Paraguay and Brazil. When you look at the location of that place, I mean, it's a huge free trade zone. Most free trade zones are located like near ports and where ships come in. This is like at the head of the Iguazu Falls, the Cataratas of the Iguazu, and it's got this massive airport over in Brazil, where a lot of goods are flown in planes, and the Muslim population lives in Brazil, not in Paraguay. They cross the bridge every morning there. And then the last major site is Iquique, Chile. Now, I did work 25 years ago in laying out some of the family relationships. You even had the bin Ladens in Cologne, Panama. But the Hachems, the Wakeds, these families would their cousin, brother, uncle, I mean extended families had merchant relationships, tied it all together. Now I'm going into detail on this because the the current effort to portray Venezuela as having manipulated elections is being pushed by Gary Burnson. I know Gary. He's a CIA officer. He was the second. He led the second, what was called Jawbreaker team into Afghanistan in late October of 2001 after the 9/11 attacks. And he wrote a book called Jawbreaker, I think, with Ralph Pizzulo, who used to be like a New York Times reporter. Well, they're now pushing this thing that since 1999, Maduro was involved with the Dominion software company and creating these voting machines. Laura Loomer did Laura Logan, excuse me, Laura Logan did like an hour and a half podcast with these guys where they lay out, oh man, the real country that's been manipulating elections globally was Venezuela, which is why we got to get rid of them now. And I'm thinking, I love irony. My mind works like a 14-year-old boy in a comedy writing team because I'm going, no, that's funny. Here's the CIA guy who's been representing an agency that's, probably overthrown an average of 3 or 4 countries per year since its inception. And we're now pinning global economic interference on Venezuela. Really?
This is why
really?
this is why comedians are going are on the street these days. It's like, reality writes better scripts than anyone ever can. This is it's insane on a different level, but it seems to be, at least in mainstream media, it's working again, right? CNN and so on, they're actually discussing this. There's like expert panels on what 20 years ago would have been the weapons of mass destruction. Should we take this? It's working.
Well, look, we're still at the stage with the media. I started my media career started, I think, in August of 1994 with the capture of Carlos the Jackal. So 31 years ago, and I that launched me into the media sphere because I gave good soundbite. I could be pithy and funny. And I actually knew what I was talking about because I'd worked with the CIA, I'd worked with State Department. I had this consulting business where I was working with U.S. military special operations forces. And, from 94 on, I was on everything. I did the CNN Crossfire probably 16 times at least. I debated Alan Dershowitz once around the Y Summit. That held under Clinton. I was on ABC Nightline at least 12 times. Jim Lehrer NewsHour multiple times. I was a NBC terrorism analyst. I was a Fox News analyst. I got paid for a year. So I went all over the media. And where we are today is, at least back then, 30 years ago, you would have different points of view represented, particularly on the electronic media, where I'm talking about the TV, the radio, the podcasts. Not today. The 2 areas where you're not going to hear an alternative voice is one about the genocide in Palestine. If you want to have Jeffrey Sachs on, he's not allowed. Ray McGovern, not allowed. Doug McGregor, not allowed. So it just it's unbelievable how completely shut down the process is. And the same with the war in Ukraine. So it's like we've got this corporatized media now that really plays gatekeeper, and they don't allow any alternative voices. The way you get rid of them, that's a conspiracy theory. So I asked people, I said, okay, when you're using that term, what do you mean? Are you saying that there are actually people in the shadows working together to manipulate or to try to produce a particular outcome without being exposed? If you're telling me that, there are those kinds of conspiracies. They exist. They're real. But if you're telling me that Maduro conspired with Dominion voting to starting in 1999 so that they'd be ready to manipulate the election in 2020 to prevent Donald Trump from getting a second term. I'm throwing I'll clean it up, a penalty flag that like you get in soccer, you go with the red card. I'm doing the red card. No, that's not what's going on. And in fact, when you go back to 2016 and look, in 2020, the 2020 election was stolen. I believe that. But it's stolen the old-fashioned way. They had pre-printed ballots that had Joe Biden's name on it that were inserted into the machines. That's all. It was simple. And I know that for a fact because my business partner, who's now retired, he actually has gone to the postal facility that handled the ballots. He's found the place where the ballots were printed. He's got the affidavits from the truck driver who hauled the ballots. He's got it documented from point A to point B or point Z. But what happened was once the idea of a fraud for 2020 was out there, we got all sorts of stories. We got, Venezuela did it with Dominion. No. It was the Chinese. The Chinese did it. No. Wait a second. It was Leonardo Spa in Italy. It was the Italians that did it. No. There was a battle in Germany between U.S. Special Forces and the CIA. People were killed. They're trying to uncover the information. Then my favorite was this guy, Dennis Montgomery, pushed, the CIA had this computer called Hammer and Scorecard. There were at least 6 and maybe 7 different theory conspiracies were claims about how the election was stolen. And all of the reason they were put out there was to create a genuine fog of war. Or if you've ever had a dog in a field and you want it to hunt a particular bird, but then a squirrel comes running at it, it chases the squirrel, not the bird. Mm-hmm. These were squirrels. They released all these squirrels, and people were chasing Leonardo Spa. No, Dominion voted. No, it's Venezuela. No, it's China. Meanwhile, the actual way that they did it, nobody looked.
What does this tell us, in your view, about the political system of the United States? Like, on paper, it's a democracy, right? But democracy is not in the voting, it's in the counting. But even beyond that, it doesn't even matter. I mean, at the end of the day, you have some people in power, right? From one side, from the other side, then you have the people in the shadows, you have the little fiefdoms and dominions. How do you understand the U.S. as a political animal, the way that it exists today?
We've got the best government money can buy. Now, the question is, who's got the money and who be paying? And that's where it gets interesting. So AIPAC's not the only one on the market for, buying up its share of members of Congress. You've got the defense industry, as I saw it firsthand with my next door neighbor. The members of Congress, these people get elected, they show up, they got to raise money. I mean, it is relentless pressure on them to call people up and ask for money, unless they've been born naturally wealthy, or they're a shrewd investor like Nancy Pelosi, to come up with money that way. So what he does, he lines up all his clients, Lockheed Martin, General Dynamics, and they go put on a fundraiser for the member of Congress, and those corporations will call some of their clients, and hey, everybody's got to come in, and they write the checks. My neighbor gave the checks to the member of Congress. Now that member of Congress is on the hook. So when my buddy Mike would call up, member of Congress would answer the phone. So that's the defense industry. Same thing goes on with the pharmaceutical industry. Big money there. So we've got a Congress that's completely corrupted and compromised. Right now with this investigation that's underway with the money out of $360 billion that went to Ukraine, we know for certain, we got bank records and documents that $48 billion was stolen by the Zelensky administration. And some of that money wound up in the pockets and bank accounts of 29 members of the House of Representatives or the U.S. Senate. And I know the names of 2 senators, one a Democrat, one a Republican. They've updated the numbers that the Democrat got is now 26 million. The amount that the Republican got is 19 million. So it's just, it's corruption. So it's not. Go ahead.
Sorry, in this sense, what this leaves us with is just the ultimate kind of the end point of unfeathered capitalism, where you have an oligopoly of people that basically runs the show in behalf of the money elite, but that gets messed up with the security apparatus and with the things below, right? Where you also have entrenched fiefdoms and so on, and that's the apparatus that moves forward, and that then creates policy papers and so on, like what just came out, the national security strategy, right?
Yeah.
Do you take the new national security strategy serious, or do you think that's just a couple of like 5-6 people who wrote something and nobody on the lower levels will take it serious? Will the beast continue working the way it worked anyhow, or does this have an impact?
I would say it's the kind of book you ought to take and have sitting on a shelf near your toilet, and that if you're ever shy of sanitary tissue, that the book itself would be useful in that regard.
But because the content reflects what you're going to put on it, or because it's totally useless?
I think it's totally useless. It signals where I've heard that Elbridge Colby had the lead in drafting the document. So let's say it reflects the thinking of Elbridge Colby. But that said, is it reflected? Are we going to see action accompanying that? Now, with respect to Europe, we are seeing the United States and Europe. I think they've had that conversation that a couple who've been together for a while have, where they say, one says to the other partner, "Yeah, I think we need to start seeing other people." That's where they're at right now. With Europe is outraged that the United States wants to go have a relationship with someone else.
But just to add, I think it's outraged in the way that the beaten wife, who has been slapped several times over the face, is outraged that he still wants to go and see somebody else. It's like, no, come back, beat me more.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's really perverse. So if what is written down on paper is put into action, it means we have a less belligerence with China and with Russia, less chance of a war. So that would be a good thing. It also talked about disengaging from the Middle East, but I think that was predicated on the assumption that A, the United States obliterated Iran's nuclear capability, which it has not, and that B, the Zionists have complete control and have contained Hamas and Hezbollah, which again I think are false assumptions. So there is, and this notion of we're going to pivot to the Western Hemisphere. I would feel more comfortable if the strategy said, you know what, we're going to see if we can fix our broken schools and our cracked roads and our crumbling infrastructure in the United States before we decide we've got a mission to go out and heal the world. So I'm not as alarmed by it. I noted with interest that with respect to Ukraine, that basically it was, okay, it's not our problem anymore. Here, Europe, good luck. We'll send you some money, and we'll send you some weapons as long as you send us money. But Ukraine is yours. You figure it out. And the Europeans are going, what? You just left the baby on our doorstep, and now we've got to care for it. They're not ready for that. So I think too much drama is attached to it because, can you go back and recall what was said in Trump's 2017 December 2017 and his national security strategy back then, and how the policy evolved? No. And same for the Biden one it came out in January 2023. So these are, usually these are forgettable documents. This is not like the document that was written in 1948 that became the foundation for U.S. policy towards the then Soviet Union and subsequently dealing with international communism. But
But that document wasn't. You're referring to George Kennan's long telegram.
yes, correct.
And that wasn't even written by an administration. That was written by a really brilliant analyst.
Yeah.
He was actually in the embassy in Moscow, right?
Yeah, he was a State Department. He was a diplomat, State Department Foreign Service officer, and had been there for quite a while. It was very, extremely knowledgeable. Yeah. So Kennan's letter, that was consequential.
Mhm.
That did help shape strategy, and guided it. But after that, we've never really seen the United States act with a strategic, like a plan, whereas China does. Good Lord. China, they get 5-year plans, and by God, they implement those. People are held accountable, which is one of the reasons that now we've seen that China has actually surpassed the West on the technological front. And, frankly, on how they care for their people in terms of health care.
Mm.
That, would you rather be in Europe, name the country in Europe where the average person, how you're going to get health care there, or in China? And again, I would argue that even the healthcare options are much better in Russia compared to the United States. But
The healthcare is a really interesting example. I mean, you can even have like capitalist countries. Although I hesitate because Japan is not a real capitalist country. But over here,
yeah,
over here, everybody gets a healthcare insurance card that you have to pay for. But if you stop paying, they don't take away the card. The service is not linked to the payment for the service. You have to, but they will punish you, but they will not take away the card. So, but that's beside the point. You're right. I mean, it's just the way that the system works, right? Is at this point is becoming dysfunctional, I would say, in large parts of the West. What about the way that Russia approaches, or because you've been to Russia and you've interviewed Mr. Lavrov, you've talked to Mr. Karaganov, and so on. How do they approach the United States as a political entity? Because you cannot. I mean, even if it's dysfunctional, it's still there, and it's still highly dangerous. Like, how do you think the Russians are approaching their relationship with the U.S. now?
well, there's a split. I think with Lavrov and Rybkov, within the foreign ministry still sees it as in Russia's interest to engage the United States, and they want to talk, and I think there is agreement across the board in Russia. Yeah, okay, let's talk to the United States if we can, if they'll listen. But you also have a growing number in the camp of Sergei Karaganov, with respect to our future's not in the West, our future's in the East. Our future's with China, it's in Siberia, maybe even with Japan, Korea, but it's the global South, but it's not with the West anymore. And so the large, I think a growing number of Russians have come to that realization and said, you know what, this is too toxic and troubling a relationship. But the other thing that's taking place now is, and you're young enough that you get to witness it, and you'll see it fall into its full fruition. The replacement of this Eurocentric financial political system that was erected at the end of World War II. Mm-hmm. And it really reflects, I call 500 years of European culture, dominated with Christianity and all the schisms that took place within that, the birth of the Industrial Revolution within Europe, and then the birth of colonial empire building, where they took the commission of Jesus to go out and and make Christians of everybody to, hey, go out and grab as much territory as you can so we can control the wealth, control the resources, and exploit the people. And that's where that mentality in Europe never arose in either Russia or China, because Russia and China didn't have colonies in Central and South America. They didn't have colonies in Africa. They didn't have colonies in Asia. They had relationships, which is a different thing, and where they would deal with people on a different level, but not the Europeans. And the Americans sort of got infected with that European mindset that, what can we get out of you? What can we take from you? How can we control you? How can we dominate you? And that is a genuine mindset in the European theater, but it's coming to an end because Europe no longer dominates in the way it did militarily and economically in the 18th and early 19th century. So there's been this transformation, and China embodies the essence of that transformation. I mean, when I was in high school, so that was 53 years ago, when Richard Nixon showed up in China with Henry Kissinger, and they opened this whole era. And, at the time, I think the Chinese literacy rate was like 60%. And, the vast majority of the population lived in poverty. And look at what they've done in 52 years. They literally they've got they've got robots doing things that, Americans can't build robots like that and produce them in any numbers. And B, when it comes to let's take literacy as a benchmark. China has now almost universal literacy. The literacy rate in the United States is 79%, with the average reading comprehension at sixth grade level is only in 50% of the population. So China has now surpassed the United States educationally, where the United States once used to be this, if you will, this, as Reagan called it, the city on a hill, a shining light that others would flock to.
Do you think that at some point, it's going to be inevitable that in the US there will be some sort of Gorbachev who will, who's strong enough and understanding enough to say we just can't go on living like this. We need to change. We need an American glasnost and perestroika.
I'm afraid the only way we'll get there is through either some economic and or military disaster. Because, it's just not in human nature to change when you think you're doing okay. And even though the signs are obvious in our society that we're not doing okay, particularly when you look at the reading and math scores of kids out of inner city high schools. It's like, only 20% can meet even a minimal standard, and then not even at grade level. The numbers at grade level are just, not even close. And we allow that to go on. And meanwhile, we're spending $360 billion in Ukraine to arm them with weapons that we can't produce. And then find ourselves in a situation that we're going to threaten China, and China just cuts off the rare earth minerals, and then all of a sudden, these critical weapon systems that the military wants to produce can't be produced because there's no alternative source for those minerals. And so you'd think somebody would sit back and be planning for this and thinking, that's why I come back. There's no strategy. Our U.S. foreign policy is more like a bad jazz band, okay? Riffing, they got a few notes they're playing and they're just all over the place. Along with, like the Saturday Night Live skit, more cowbell. We keep saying, what we need is more defense spending. Bing, 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 more cowbell.
Yeah, but the problem is that jazz band has the second largest nuclear arsenal in the world.
That would be a problem.
So this needs management. And I'm just saying, in a sense, how, to China, to Russia, to the global south, is what do we need to do for this jazz band not to go kaboom, right? Because we don't want that. We don't want that.
No.
We want the jazz band to come and play with everybody, so we have a nice tune, right? How do we achieve that?
Yeah. That's where we got to rely upon countries like Russia and China to try to be the adults in the room. The whole generation, at least in the aftermath of World War II, we still had people in leadership positions that could remember the sacrifice, what it cost. And the United States hardly paid any price in blood. And we didn't suffer serious losses, and we made a lot of money off of it. So it was good in that regard. But they still saw enough death and destruction to know, oh, this is bad. And so the George Kennans and sort of even the younger version of that, the John Glenn's. John Glenn came, he was at the, tail end of World War II as an early astronaut. But you still had people that put a priority on arms control agreements. And even in the height of the Cold War in the 70s, the United States and the Soviet Union were able to agree first on assault treaties, strategic arms limitation treaties. Then we got to the anti-ballistic missile treaties and the intermediate nuclear forces agreements. So we were actually able to reach agreements with the Soviets. And now, what has happened once the Soviet Union disappears? It's not Russia that walks away from those agreements. It's George W. Bush cancels the ABM agreement. It's Donald Trump that cancels the INF agreement. And here's Russia saying, hey, we got this new star. Let's sort of keep that alive. And the United States and Trump administration said, oh, we'll see. We're not sure. It's not a priority. It's dangerous.
It's the height of irresponsibility, but
Yeah.
Yeah. I seriously wonder how to manage it, because this cannot be managed by one single country alone, not even by the United States. I mean, nobody in the US has the single-handed capacity to manage this. It just don't,
Right.
because it's a network of how stuff works. Larry, thank you. This was very insightful. People who want to, and we will do follow-ups on this, especially about also Russia, because I'm a great fan of the way that you're trying to engage and to understand what's going on there. We've never needed understanding for the other parts of the world more than now. Because it's getting more and more dangerous. But people want to follow you and see that analysis also develop. Where should they go?
Sonar21.com. SONAR21.com. Let me say one, I'll just in closing offer one observation, which I found terribly insightful. And it was offered up by Vyacheslav Fetisov, or Fetisov, depending on how you pronounce it. I pronounce it wrong. But Slava was his nickname. He was the preeminent hockey player in Russia in the late 70s, and throughout the 80s. And then into the 90s, he came to the United States and played. And he was he ended his career with the Detroit Red Wings. And with the Detroit Red Wings, they won 2 back-to-back Stanley Cups with Slava. What a decent man he is. And he's sanctioned. He can't travel to the United States because of his, association with Putin and the Russian government. But so his daughter, though, lives in the United States, and he's got at least one grandchild, maybe 2, in the United States that he can't see. They have to travel to Russia. But what he told me about when he moved from playing hockey in Russia to coming to the West to play hockey, he said the biggest shock for him was how in the West it was so individualistic. They weren't saying we are a team, we must play together, we must complement and reinforce each other, we must be a unit. He said that mindset just didn't exist in the West. And one of the reasons they succeeded in Detroit is they brought in 4 other Russians. And the Russians all brought that mindset of not that I've got to be the star, but how can we work together to achieve a goal? Now, that's not communism. That is a cultural attitude that is, I don't want to say it's unique to Russia, but it is at the heart and soul of Russia. And that's why I think, boy, Russia's got something to teach the world on that front. If we can learn that mentality, not how can I get ahead, not how can I be the star, how can I work together with others as a unit that we can, in fact, score the goal, get the puck in the net, put the ball in the hoop, pick your sports metaphor. But, I think that was a very profound insight for me.
If we manage to collaborate, we could go so far. We could go again to the moon and the stars.
Yes.
It's just I keep when I teach international relations, I usually start with a picture of the globe and saying, like, look, we're 8 billion people on this marble floating through space, condemned to self-organization, and we're just not good at organizing. We're just not good at it. Instead of working together, we kill each other. We make a sport out of it, right?
Yeah.
Depressing. But very good remarks, Larry Johnson. Everybody who wants to follow Larry, go to sonar21.com. I'll put the link into the description below, and we will talk again. Larry Johnson, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you, my friend. It was a pleasure.